and to welcoming all of you to the forum and to our conversation with Odette Harper Hynes. My name is Patricia Sullivan. I'm at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for Afro-American Research here at Harvard, where I'm working as managing editor of the Encyclopedia Africana project, edited by Anthony Appia and Henry Louis Gates, Jr. It is a great pleasure and honor to participate in this evening's program. As A.J. Verdell and I were commenting earlier today, this is truly our Black History Month moment. Odette Harper Hynes' life and political activism spans much of this century. Her story provides a focus for understanding the critical ways in which Black culture and the Black-led struggle for social and economic justice have enhanced and tested the limits of the democratic aspirations so central to the American experience. It is also a pleasure for me to introduce A.J. Verdell, who will in turn introduce Odette Harper Hynes. A.J., a social science researcher turned novelist, is author of the prize-winning novel, The Good Negress. She is currently a Bunting Fellow in Literature. She comes to the Harvard community with a realist's focus on the trajectory of human development and a novelist's interest in human living and gesture. And for any of you who were fortunate enough to be at her presentation at the Bunting yesterday, her novel In Progress, Meanwhile Back at the Ranch, is something truly to look forward to. A.J.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in this conversation with Mrs. Odette Harper Hynes. And I think the primary reason that I'm so delighted is because in Mrs. Hynes' life is a tremendous wealth of detail about the ordinary citizen's activity contributing to the larger community that we call country. Mrs. Hynes has been involved in almost every major movement that you can identify that's existed during her lifetime. She was born in Bronx, New York, from into a family that originated in the South, like many African-American families. She is part of the Harper family, a very large clan, and they trace their lineage back, at least in part, to the Jefferson family, which may or may not seem significant to you. Mrs. Hynes also participated in the Works Projects Administration. She participated at a very high level as publicity director in the NAACP. Mrs. Hynes has worked in the Head Start program and has lived much of her adult life in Alexandria, Louisiana, which may or may not seem to be backwoods to you. Mrs. Hynes went to Alexandria to witness or to research a very grim event, which, if you've read the book All Is Never Said, which is a very well-written, very beautifully constructed oral history. So there's some synergy in this history between the words that are spoken and the words that are written. And one of the great joys of reading the book is trying to identify and clarify the line between the written and the spoken word. However, in this book, the grim event that took place in Alexandria that first brought Mrs. Hynes to Alexandria and made her decide that she never wanted to return there, that event is documented, and then later, after she marries an African-American physician named Jimmy Hynes, she moves back to Alexandria, Louisiana, where he's from, and lives there the rest of her adult life. When I was invited to participate in this conversation, I hadn't admittedly heard of Odette Harper Hynes, and the one thing that convinced me that I should probably examine how I could contribute to this event was that I learned that Mrs. Hynes was a high school French teacher. And after having come through civil rights and all kinds of foot soldier activities, and I'm missing the Red Cross activities during World War II, which is also a hugely significant sort of participation from my perspective. So when I heard that she had come through all of these major movements in our country and then had become a high school French teacher in Alexandria, Louisiana, I was duly impressed and duly silenced and duly interested in reading. So I encourage you all who are here to listen carefully to what we can learn about Odette Harper Hynes and to prepare your individual questions as you can. But also to take this opportunity to familiarize yourself with the title of this book and get this book and read this book, because the presence of a living person who has written and constructed a clear, transparent, vital oral history, I think is a much rarer bird than I could articulate. So we'll begin.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you both for letting me come, and thank you for being here. I'm accused of having a small voice. Can people hear me? Yes. Okay. And because I am not always capable of following through on a thought when I just speak for myself, I've written down this stuff, and I'll read it. It was in the third year of our present century that W.E.B. Du Bois parted the veil just enough to let a callous world glimpse the souls of black folks. And then 17 years later, declaring himself to be singularly clairvoyant, this towering intellectual, this Moses to a blind America, announced and proved that he could also see in and through the souls of white folks. And although a 1920 issue of the New Republic published Du Bois's keen perception of our country's politically endorsed sin-sick soul, we remember that phrase from a hymn, it was for more than 40 years that any real action was taken to heal that soul. But indicative of Du Bois's balance is the fact that in the same article in which he exposed what was going on that was so evil, he also recognized that, as Sarah Teasdale claims, that life does hold loveliness, does have loveliness to sell, and that music is like a curve of gold, and that the eyes of little children seem to hold wonder like a cup, and that, as far as he was concerned, pessimism is cowardice. And I think many of us have based our lives on that little phrase. But fortunately, by the time we reached the mid-60s, the probing X-ray eyes of television cameras had revealed enough for some effort to be made toward achieving a cure of the sin-sick souls. Although the 60s are usually referred to as the civil rights era, actually, the push for civil rights began with the introduction of slavery. Mm-hmm. The guidebook that the slaves memorized because they could not read told them that whenever 3 or more of you gather together in my name, you will find spiritual strength. So with great stealth, they broke the law that forbade assembly and sang their hymns with those dual meanings. Steal away home to Jesus didn't necessarily mean that they were heaven-bound. It could mean freedom-bound. As a passenger on the Underground Railroad, and to get on board, little children, because the gospel train is leaving. And with the help of those early white civil rights advocates and activists, those heaven-sent northern abolitionists, black and white, slave and free, who would not let nothing turn them around, the slow trek toward freedom crept on, culminating finally in a bloody war. Then, after emancipation, there came the grief of Reconstruction. But with the advent of the 20th century, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Urban League came into being, both strong civil rights organizations with dedicated leadership fighting for equal social and economic freedom for all Americans. The NACB and Urban League were vanguard, but there were other groups with similar goals. So it was that in 1964, workers from the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, came to live with my family and me in our small, deep South city. They were a brave and racially mixed group of 3 young college students, and their leader was a Bostonian, Judith Ann Rollins, who is now a professor at Wellesley College, and who was among, and has among her ancestors strong black men who soldiered in the Civil War. It was with Judy that I did an oral history. She would put questions to me, I'd answer them, and then they'd get typed up, and we'd delete the question, and we have a running. If you read the book, it sounds exactly like me gabbing.
That's great.
It's not a literary piece, I'm sure. The core workers' job in the 1960s was to get African Americans registered to gain access to public facilities, the schools, the libraries, the restaurants, the parks, the zoos, any place in the world. Oh, in a word, to liberate us. They were trying to make us free. And that meant having the coffee or the food they ordered spit into, their car chased down lonely roads, and even the life of their leader, James Farmer, nearly snatched from him. The whole gamut of human viciousness. As for my life, in terms of Langston Hughes's poem, it's been no crystal stair, but instead, I guess, a kind of rude and rickety ladder full of splinters and assertive rusty nails. And though I realize that in my lifetime, I and those climbing with me cannot reach the top, but we've kept on climbing. And I am lifted by the heartening fact that I've been privileged to spend part of my allotted time on this planet in a period of at least some change. And because of the pride I have in the generations that preceded me, and because of the faith and hope I have in the generations that will follow, that's where this, somewhere I put the rest of it, that in the generations that will follow, where am I find my life a great joy. That's it.
Thank you. Well, I'll second AJ's suggestion more than to obtain this book, because it is so full of sort of builds on what Mrs. Hynes just sort of put forward, how she sketches out this context of history and struggle and social change and how it happens, and how you have to live with the ambiguities and a sense of climbing and moving and never quite getting there, but being able to move forward and imagine a better place. And her book is full of personalities that many well known to us, but they don't have cameo appearances. They're very much woven into the struggles that she participates in and the organizations she works with. And one individual in particular who is still very much someone most everyone knows about is Thurgood Marshall, since he was with us just till very recently, and is, like Mrs. Hynes, a century person, a person whose life and activism fills much of the 20th century. And we were wondering if you might comment a bit on Thurgood Marshall, the person you knew, and the nature of your relationship with him over the years, and how your lives interfaced.
In the beginning of the 40s, after I'd had a stint with the Writers Project, Walter White asked me to come and work as the Director of Publicity and Promotion at the NAACP. The office then was at 69 Fifth Avenue in the lower part of Manhattan, and it was held in a loft. In the earlier part of my life, I had attended meetings. My mother would take me to meetings in the Harlem churches because the NAACP headquarters was too small for any group of people. And I came to the NAACP at the time that Thurgood Marshall was the legal person there. And one of my jobs was to produce the press releases, and often I accompanied other people to things that they had to look into. And the reason I was there was largely because the war had gathered up many of the men on staff, including Carl Murphy. And they had, so it wasn't a likely thing for a woman to work there. I must have been 29, 20, somewhere along there. And among the things that I did was go with Thurgood to different places. And a place I went to was called Alexandria, Louisiana. Thurgood had been asked to come down and intercede for three, Adams, Bodenave, and Mitchell, I can never forget their names, who were at Camp Claiborne. And the state, and I'm mixed up about this, the state of Louisiana had not paid, had not received the rent from the federal government for the site that Camp Claiborne was on. So it was kind of a mixed up court-martial. And I went at a time when there had been a lynching in the city of Alexandria, not a lynching, a mob had formed of soldiers, and they'd been killed, about 18 of them, because the people in the community thought that they were a little bit too uppity in their little uniforms than they wanted any blacks to be. So the police force had shot down 18 of them. I've recently seen the FBI reports where a lot of the stuff is blacked out because the federal government didn't want it disclosed about what had happened, and the bodies of these soldiers were put in two different funeral homes, and they were, according to the people there, stacked up the same way we were on the slave ships that brought us over here. There were so many in the small funeral homes. Right now, I'm getting off the track. There is a son of a white man who was a traveling salesman, and he came to that town and was bored at night, wanted to leave his hotel, and somebody told him not very correctly how to reach the theater. And he got a little lost, ended up in the black community, and ducked into the black movie theater. And from his vantage point, he saw this one-armed bailiff kill a black fellow. And it bothered him all of his days. So he told a black soldier. He told his son about this, and his son, years afterwards, because it still preyed on his mind, and his son is now, he's an historian, and he's trying to get all the different pieces of that particular story. Oh. Anyway, to get back to what I was supposed to say, Thurgood saw about this case, and eventually the fellows were relieved of it. But we were on a train very shortly after that, very anxious to get back home. And I remember putting a big red pin on the map of, it had Alexandria on it, and vowing that I would never go back to that place. And I find that I've lived there 50 years. More than 50 years, 51 years. Then later on, there was, you're asking just about Thurgood. There was my husband was falsely accused of a murder of a young woman. And Thurgood coached us from his place in New York to how to handle that case. Shortly before that, I had been taken off a train in a place called Newport, Arkansas. And on a train, the conductor is the arresting officer. It's like a captain on a ship. And this conductor was irked by the sight of me going into one of the Pullman coaches and talking with another black person, a woman who was a lieutenant, a nurse lieutenant in the armed services. And at that point, some of the returnees, this is after the war, in 1945, two Air Force officers noticed us through the window in a train station and stepped out and got us some cold coffee and stale donuts, teasing us with the fact that that's what I'd been handing out to them in the war theaters of North Africa and Italy, and France, and wherever. And this bothered the conductor, so the conductor had me arrested. We got into a town, and the train was stopped, and we always referred to large black men as big black, big and burly. And these were big and burly white army police, what do you call those? Military police. And they boarded the train and took me and a person that had been, a young man who had been asked to see to my bags and whatnot. And he was a law student out of Montana, black, but with a, not with a heavy southern accent, but he assumed one. And he said to these arresting police, can I go along with her, because she plumb crazy. And they were happy to lock up anything that they could find. So they took us through this crowded Jim Crow car that I had been obliged to sit in. And as we got to the vestibule of the place, there were soldiers on, however many black folks they had, they went in that one Jim Crow coach. So these were soldiers sitting on duffel bags and whatever. And one of them reached up and stuffed something in this Red Cross overcoat that I had over my arm. And it was an Italian Beretti that he had, was bringing home. So then we were pushed out of the conductor claimed that I had been drunk and disorderly and had cussed out my, the porter that took me to see the black person in the other coach. And I was shoved down the stairs. I think I go in more detail in that book. And pushed along the street, constantly asking, where is this? And told to shut my so-and-so mouth up. And finally, I decided he can't really ever keep me from babbling. So I kept on asking what town it was and telling them that they had no authority over me because I was quasi-military. And that dawned on them that maybe they didn't have authority. So they took me to a little storefront place that says City Hall. And this is about 1 in the morning, and I don't know why any of those folks were in there, but there was a black guy cleaning up, and they had him a little jug, and he was sharing in the drinking of whatever was in that jug. And then they decided to examine me, which was just an excuse for being obnoxious. And they patted me all down, and then they went into my bag and discovered the things that I had in there and made very strange comments about that. And then I was ushered into a little closet that had all kinds of human waste in a vessel there. And I sat there being very upset. But I got out writing materials and wrote to everybody that I could think of in New York, and I had contacts with the newspapers because of the press stuff. And I told them that I was somewhere below the Mason-Dixon line and don't make too much fuss, but get me out of there. And I was really very frightened. And then the black guy came along, and I gave him the letters. I had stamps and stuff, and I wrote, I guess, about 5 letters that almost nobody could read because my hand was shaking. But to look at the postmark and see where this place was. And I gave these letters to the black guy, and he apparently mailed them because they did reach places that I sent them. And Thurgood was asked to come and help do something about it. Then the next day, I was ushered up to a loft above this, at the back of this place, over a garage, and the judge who was to hear this thing was a civilized person who was a war returnee, and he understood exactly what had happened, and he asked me to tell what had happened, and I did. And then he asked the fellow who had gone along with me and let himself be arrested what had happened, and he said, and he was asked, well, what did you see? Because he was supposed to be a witness. And the fellow said, I didn't see nothing because I was asleep. So that was the end of that. There was no witness, and there was no case. So we were able then to sue the Missouri Pacific Railway. But you couldn't get Thurgood to come south because he'd just been in a place where when he got off the train, the sheriff had doused him well with liquor and carted him off to jail. So that, then subsequent to that, my husband was accused of a murder and long distance. Thurgood kind of engineered that so that it came out. I won't go into that tale. He was oftentimes a guest in our home. He was a hearty, ebullient person who had insight into most of the things that went on in the United States, and I was proud to know him.
Mm-hmm. Did you know at that time what a hugely great man he was? Did you know what a hugely great man he was at that time?
If you ever met Thurgood, you know the minute you saw him that he was a great man.
So that story touches on a lot of, most of what we consider were the travesties of our time, the segregation, the unreasonable carting off to prison, the randomness of racist activity, and the desperation. I mean, you don't talk about it so much, but in the book, the story is very clearly desperate and very clearly frightening. And although we don't probably have as much individual attack, depending on your opinion, in this time, this time is sort of frightening again. It almost seems like a return of an awful time, again, because we have so many ways in which we're not making progress, and we're not feeling so positive as a community. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about whether you think that we're encountering problems that are just as bad, just as...
In many ways, I see us going back to 1854. We have in our town, in our state, our current governor is the grandson of the gentleman who was part of the Plessy Ferguson deal. And he is working toward, what do you call it, chain gangs. He, at his inaugural, he didn't prepare a speech. He didn't have to. He simply read the speech that his grandfather.
Well, there it is.
No.
Gospel truth, too. So you know where we are. We also have a native son called David Duke, and we love him. And
Well, let me follow that up with a question about the segregation integration scenario. Because when you talked about your work with the YWCA in Louisiana, there's a whole section in the book about your work with that charitable organization and how you all had a house that was yours where programs were run for black children and black adults. You had sewing meetings and various things like that. And there was tension between the black YWCA or the black Y.
it was a bridge playing outfit.
The white Y.
The white one. And the black one was an effort to do something with young people who needed something done. And it was kind of sad. And eventually, they called themselves Integrating the Y, and the local people managed that beautifully. They took the Y out to an area where no one without transportation could ever get to, and they built a beautiful plant. And that's where it stands today. There are some blacks who can go out there, but they're not enough to disturb anybody. And this is the way we handle, in many instances, desegregation of the South. Currently, we're going to go back to the neighborhood school. And you can't make too much of a squawk about that, because actually the neighborhood schools built in the late 50s in hopes that blacks would be content to stay in them are in much better shape than the white schools are now. So you can't say that separate ain't equal anymore. You know? So the black schools are actually better. So what should have happened was they should have bused the children into the newer black schools. But they foresaw a time, I'm feeling, that they could go back where they wanted to be under the guise of putting blacks back where they wanted them to be. Am I answering anything you're asking?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so what I'm wondering, I mean, we have the one end where we have the very problematic Jim Crow transportation, and then we have the other end where we have the activist foot soldier individuals like you creating this vibrant organization like the Y, and then once the Y is integrated, it creates a disaster for the people who are being served in the black Y. Is there any way in which you felt like segregation was working? Or do you think that integration...
there were ways. Oh, yes. Employment. Alexandria is in the middle of an agrarian section. There isn't too much in the way of manufacture or anything. It is a warehouse center. And the work for many of the people is seasonal, and in black households, the wife keeps a job through the year because the household she works in lasts through the year. Cotton doesn't. Oh, may I tell you a cotton story? In the late 50s, a truck came to my house to pick up my children. They were young people, young children. Maybe the oldest was about 9. And they were going to take them. They'd shut up the schools, because they do that. They had done that for years. Sometimes the schools were only open during the hot summer months, because other months they could be on the either picking it or planting. And they were going to take all black children and have them out in the fields. And it made me kind of mad. So I got a truck, and I made a sign that said, "What color is cotton? Pick it yourself." And I took it up to the school board. And surprisingly, they reopened the school. They didn't know whether we were going to start some ruckus after that. Another funny story is, if you want to hear these.
Yes, we do.
Oh God, what was the funny story?
It's okay. So was there a way in which?
Oh,
go ahead.
It's come back. Trying to get Head Start underway. I had an equivalent program in my backyard for years. And then a friend of mine, my oldest daughter's godmother, wrote and said, "Det, Lady Bird is talking about starting something that sounds just like that mess that you have in your backyard." So I did the proposal. We call our counties parishes down there, and I did the proposal for Rapides Parish and was going to get the grant and needed the summer, Head Start in the beginning was a summer program, and was going to, wanted very much to have the schools so that we could have pleasant places for the kids to work in, because the first year of that, we had to have the Head Start program out on the air base, where many of the homes were, there was a civilized group of warriors out there, and they let us use their homes as Head Start centers. And so the second year, we're still trying to get schools, and the mayor had told Sergeant Shriver that there wasn't any poverty there. There was just some lazy niggers who didn't want to work. Besides, the schools couldn't let them be put to use unless their janitors went with them. And the wage scale that the government had instituted would spoil those janitors, so they weren't going to have any of that either. So they consistently refused to let us use the schools. And I had built a friendship with one of the leading lawyers in our town, and I, like the book does, I told him everything that had been happening because he was trustworthy. And I'd also told him about the time that A. Philip Randolph and Walter White had gone to ask President Roosevelt for some kind of edict that would force the country to employ blacks in the war industries. So I told him that A. Philip Randolph listened to Franklin Roosevelt, because in our office we had the benefit of Mrs. Roosevelt as a board member. Yep. So it was nice working. So she would try to fill him in on what he ought to be doing sometimes. And Roosevelt said, oh no, he couldn't do that. It would disrupt the war effort, and the people wouldn't agree unless the blacks were in there with their brooms and mops. So Randolph listened, and Randolph was a magnificent somebody. I wish all of you had known him. And he said, well, Mr. President, I think you ought to be forewarned that if this doesn't happen, we've scheduled a march on Washington. And this was kind of crazy because it was at a time when they had succeeded in frightening to death every black person in these United States. And I hardly think he'd gotten more than maybe a dozen of us to walk on the Capitol. But Roosevelt didn't know that. And Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8802. And blacks were employed in the war industries. So Camille Gravel, the lawyer that I had told all this stuff to over the years, I went to him and I was pretty downhearted. You do get down sometimes. And I don't mean it in the sense that we use the word. I wasn't talking black English. Camille said, "Oh, you know what to do. Don't come worrying me with that." And I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "You do know what to do. Didn't you tell me that Randolph told the President of the United States that if the blacks didn't get employment in the war industries, there was going to be a march on Washington? Wait until late tonight and call Morgan Walker." Morgan Walker was the head of the school board, and he also owned the Continental Trailways. Call him and tell him that you feel that he ought to know this. Of course, the final decision would be his, but we certainly didn't want any unrest in this community, and the blacks were going to march on the school board next morning. We got the schools.
It worked. Yes, yes.
Whatever.
So it's enormous the way that the things that you do in Alexandria, for example, are connected with these big things happening, say, in Washington. I mean, you had a relationship with A. Philip Randolph that began in your father's
childhood.
house, right?
In my grandfather. I was born in a home that had 4 generations in it. My great-grandfather had built it in 1869. And in it were my great-grandmother and my grandparents, my own parents, and 3 boy cousins, and me.
And how was it to be living in a house that was built by your grandfather?
This was up in the Fordham area of the the Bronx in New York. Does anybody know that? Yeah. We were 2 blocks away from Fordham University. It wasn't there then. And my great-grandfather had, I'll tell you about my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather had come from Elk Hill Plantation in Goochland County in Powhatan, Virginia. And my great-grandfather's father was the son of Mary Jefferson Thomas, Mary Jefferson Thomas, Thomas Jefferson's father's sister. And Thomas Turpin, there's a reference to Thomas Turpin being the executor of Peter Jefferson will. And great-grandfather's father had gone to Baton Rouge and purchased him a slave that he took back to Goochland County, and they had 2 children. And after the birth of the second one, he took the lady to Canada and married her and brought her back to Goochland County, which didn't set too well on the natives, and they burned his house down. And then he'd rebuild it, and they'd burn it again. At home, I have silver that came from that house, made out of silver without an alloy, and the bowls have broken away, not fully, but have parted from the stems of the spoons. Great-grandfather thought that his father must have been, he was a planter, but he thought that he must have been a gambler too, because they lived in the home with their parents, and when they'd come down to breakfast in the morning, there'd be these piles of silver on the table, and it got converted into tableware piles of coins I'm talking about. Great-grandfather was reared with the daughter of the plantation cook. The daughter, reared by her, because that plantation cook's daughter had been bought by an Indian named Running Cock and freed. And the children out of that marriage, there were two of them, Uncle William and my great-grandmother, were born free. But when the black ex-slave died in a fire, in a very gruesome, she was struck by lightning. And the Indian brought, that's another of my grandpas, brought back the little girl to be under the wing of her grandmother, who incidentally was not allowed to be called grandmother. If you reached a certain age and you behaved yourself reasonably well, you were called aunt, so she was Aunt Nell. And the family lines were completely ignored, the way you'd ignore them if you were handing out puppies, you know. Mm-hmm. And grandmother, great-grandmother, received the same kind of schooling that the master's children received, who incidentally were never freed. And his excuse for not doing that was because he could protect them more in his home than he could if he let them run loose and they would be caught up again by the patrollers. So he saw to it that they were given some schooling. They hired a French tutor, and great-grandmother shared in this schooling. But by the time she reached 16, it wasn't very safe for her, a free person, to be in Virginia. So my great-grandfather's father, that my great-grandmother always referred to as an old reprobate, sold her grandmother and took some of the funds to send her to New York, where, because she had been semi-educated, she taught in a black school, black church that had a little school in it in Brooklyn. And a great-grandfather knew of this. After he'd made a trip to New Orleans to find him a wife like his mother, and he didn't find one. He said the slaves were a mangy lot, and he went to New York and married my great-grandmother. Then there is this story that he would tell us in the mornings on our way to school, and we'd been given a little booze, a little whiskey, and this is in the winter months, and lemon juice and hot water and stuff that was to ward off the cold. I don't know why you figured that out. But in the course of telling us, giving us this morning send-off, he would tell us stories that were stuck in my head, and I didn't know they were there until we started on the book, because most of the time we were all sitting there first on one foot and the other wondering when he was going to stop, you know, so we could get out of there. But we remembered the things. And the story he told us about why we were in that house was when he came to New York and went to the Bronx to find a house. It was in a time of horse-drawn streetcars. He had to walk from Tremont up to where this property was, and he was standing on one side of the road looking over at another plot of land, and a white man came up to him and said he understood he was trying to buy property, but don't consider that over there. And grandfather asked him why, and he said, because niggers live over there, and I know you wouldn't want to live next to them. So his great joke and his great fun, with his cobalt blue eyes twinkling, was to tell us that he bought the spot right next to the man who had told him that, and brought little brown Betty, who was his wife, to live there. So, what was I supposed to be answering?
They're great stories. It's fun. But one of the things that you are talking about is this big role that your family played, right? You're talking about how important your great-grandfather was in building a house with his own hands.
Mm-hmm. His brother was a carpenter. Now, my grandfather on my mother's side, Peter Desiree, had come up from Charleston. And he built the row houses that the Italian families lived in across in later years, because that was after the my grandmother had grown up and married him. There were 5 of us in that household after my Aunt Gertrude died, and my mother took over the care of her 3 sons. And individually, we all got carted off to, I guess, all of the NAACP meetings. And we sat and listened, and we'd get taken to Carnegie Hall to hear Roland Hayes. Mm-hmm. And we were filled up with that stuff. Somebody asked me when I started, how I got into civil rights, and I said it was very much like a Lutheran being born into the Lutheran church. There was never a time when there wasn't some civil rights something in my life.
So you mentioned Roland Hayes. You also met Paul Robeson?
Oh yeah, Paul Robeson. His brother was a pastor at Mother Zion Church, and in my childhood I saw him, but I didn't really get to see Paul Robeson until in the late 30s when I was working on the Writers Project, and one of the young women in the typist's pool was in a chorus with him. The chorus, it was a thing written called The Ballad for Americans, and he had the lead, of course, in it. And I, as I said to somebody else when I get very Southern, I said that I, who can't carry a tune in a bucket, we say that down south, knew I couldn't join the chorus, but I wanted to be near Paul Robeson, and I'd heard of the lovely after rehearsal sessions that he had. So I wormed my way in by doing the notes for the rehearsals. And so I was able to listen to Paul Robeson. And then Paul Robeson suffered a great deal because America objected to the fact that he said he'd been civilly treated in Russia. And they didn't want to hear that. So they labeled him a red, which he was not. But he was a person who loved humanity and liked to see other people who seemed to care about it.
Thank you.
We've given up many of our listed questions to listen to these delightful stories, but we don't want to use up your time in that way, so you're welcome to come to either one of these mics and ask any questions you have of Mrs. Hynes. Oh,
I tell you, it might help if you gave them a list of the various things that I had been involved in. World War II.
The Red Cross.
The Red Cross.
Go ahead.
What else was it?
Well, I think as AJ said, any social movement, civil rights struggle, North or South, last 80 years, maybe 75.
Mrs. Hynes
has been there, so you can assume that. And would you please introduce yourself also? Thank you.
I'm Bob Buckley. I'm a local performing poet in this area. And one of the things that I've been involved with is trying to decipher, understand Du Bois and the NAACP, and the isolation of Ida B. Wells in that same body of policy making for the NAACP. Could you provide any information on the relationship between Ida B. Wells and Du Bois on the board? I understand that Du Bois had somewhat of a struggle going on with Walter White. Okay. Was Ida B. Wells on that same board?
Yes, but I didn't know her. She had been there before I got there. Yeah, and I didn't know her.
It seems that history says that she was too radical, or that Du Bois simply wanted to be like the king of the turf, or the only black on the turf.
Well, so did Walter. There's always
okay.
Kings.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Hynes moved into W.E.B. Du Bois's office.
Oh, yes, and Du Bois was one of my heroes. So when I got there, the little gold letters on the door had Du Bois's name, and the workman came to scrape that off and put my name up there. And I pled with them to please let it stay up there at least 2 weeks so I could enjoy it before they stuck my name up.
Hi, my name is Juliette Armstrong, And I just want to let you know that I've really enjoyed your stories, and I look forward to having you come to my bookstore in Brockton on Saturday, so we can get a real personal, intimate
Thank you.
experience in hearing your
Thank you.
stories. And but my question is, I want to hear a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance period, Langston Hughes, Ralph Ellison. Any information you can give me about those individuals, I think would be wonderful.
Just that I knew them and liked many of those people. My initial contact with those folks is when I was about 14 or so, in the late 20s. And I had a relative, maybe some of you know of the National Urban League, and Lester Granger was the director there. He was, at that point, the acting director, because Eugene Kinkle-Jones was ill. And Lester lived in the same apartment building in 409 Edgecombe Avenue, which is Sugar Hill, that we call it, in Harlem. And in that building lived Walter White, Thurgood Marshall, Langston Hughes, and around the corner was Anna Bontemps. And one of the things that I and my closest friend Fanny did was Lester would have what he called Sunday brunches, and he would make kidney stew and spoon bread. And he was a good cook, but he was a messy cook, and he asked us, and he'd give us a few pennies for it, to come and clean up the pots and the dishes after this. But these people came to the brunches, and it was wonderful to sit and listen, and we were happy to be there to do whatever, to listen to Langston Hughes and oh, after a while, he had Langston Hughes had an aunt came to keep house for him, and she was at one of the brunches, and she told this funny story. She was a designer of clothing and stuff, and she had to go to these white homes. And she was asked at one point to get off an elevator that was for people and not for black folks. And the elevator operator, there were people who operated elevators. You all would not remember that, but people who operated elevators. And the elevator fellow apologized to her for telling her that he had to tell her that. And he said that he had nothing against black folks, that one had raised him. So she said, and I love this, well, she did a damn poor job.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Flores, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And I'm a Mexican-American from Texas. And so listening to a lot of your stories, it has the same flavor of a lot of the stories that I heard growing up from my grandpa.
Absolutely.
And how, you know, he would go to restaurants and see signs that said, no dogs, no Mexicans. And, you know, and he went through this a lot, you know, the civil rights movement in San Antonio. And I was always curious as to, you know, we had two separate movements going at the same time, and why didn't Hispanics and African Americans join? I mean, I've always been trying to figure that out. And was there any talk? I mean, you knew so many important people.
I think in the last pages of that, I talk about my distress at all this polarization and the fact that everything would be really lovely if we could learn to appreciate each other's cultures and get to understand one another and have some unity. Yes. I feel the same way you do.
Hi, Ms. Hynes. I'm Rick Wade. I, too, am from the South, a native of South Carolina, and we appreciate your being here this evening. Many suggest today that race relations in America today, that we're moving into an era where there's, again, a nation that is becoming two nations, one white and one black, separate and unequal. And you've been there, you've seen the good and the bad of America with regards to race relations. And my question is, from your experiences and the movements that you've been a part of, what can we take from those movements and utilize in today's society to help heal this ever-widening gap between the black and white races of America?
I don't think it can get too much wider, and I hope it won't. And I think maybe it will come back together again. The only thing I think I told somebody yesterday or the day before when they asked what I thought of Farrakhan, that those persons have some kind of use in what we're trying to do. I gave it as an example, Stokely Carmichael, who was a separatist too, and Rap Brown were threatening to come to our town, for instance. And the mayor also heard that Martin Luther King wanted to come there. So he was obliged to choose what he thought was the lesser evil. And we got to hear Martin Luther King. So there is Farrakhan, when he speaks of, as did Marcus Garvey, when they spoke of the separatism, it did do something to bring blacks together and to say, as County Cullen did, I too sing America. And I'm hoping that that's going to be part of what's ahead of us. But I hope our understanding includes this young lady and all the Asian people and everybody who comes here. America is supposed to be America, and I hope that we make it that. I'm not too scared. I've tried to follow Du Bois. Pessimism is cowardice.
Good evening, Mrs. Hynes. My name is Eric Narcisse, and I'm a resident from next door in Texas, and I wanted to thank you for being here tonight. My question is about the role of women in the early stages of the civil rights movement. Do you believe history has underestimated the contributions of African American women to the movement? And do you have any personal observations about the role women played during your involvement with the NAACP and other social movements?
The role of women in the early civil rights movement.
Well, we all know Fannie Lou Hamer, and we know that there's been terrific strength in the women, as has always been. I didn't get to see the movie Gone with the Wind until very recently, and realized that the only sane and strong character in the whole darn thing was the mammy.
But as a woman in the NAACP in the 1940s, you worked with Ella Baker.
Oh, yes.
And
yes,
I
yes.
think a point to is that the earlier movement
Oh,
in
yes,
the
yes.
40s and 50s.
These are strong people. Yeah. They still are.
Ella Baker was the one who was so charismatic when she delivered speeches.
Oh, yes. The voice just boomed out of her. She didn't need any pieces of paper.
Was she in great demand?
Yes, by people who cared. She was very much in the youth movement and with, what did SCLC mean?
The Southern Christian Leadership Conference and that, and then of course the SNCC, the
Yeah.
Student Nonviolent
And
Coordinating
SNCC,
Committee. Later.
She too was a dear friend, yeah. I grabbed her one day and had her stay with me so I could make her put her feet up, you know. Stay at my house.
She also got isolated as a radical black person, isolated.
Do you think that Ella Baker was isolated as a radical sort of end of the movement, or was she?
Only by the uninformed. You know, you're always going to have some folks that, no, that was not, I don't know what history is saying, and I don't know whether some folks who wanted her isolated are writing about her. I don't know.
Any more questions?
Is that it?
Well, why don't we?
Go ahead.
No.
Are we done with our questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Comments?
Well, I do hope that you all will rush out and read the lyrical details of Mrs. Odette Harper Hynes' life. And since we have no more questions and we won't go back to our list, I will just very briefly thank you all for coming and read this closing, which I've written having finished All Is Never Said. May every worthy history and herstory find a clear path to a hungry public. May every history and herstory be worthy. May all the details of our vibrant lives cohere logically and safely and motivationally. May the causes we choose be the causes we change. And may all of us, under penalty of total invisibility, choose at least one cause and work vigorously for it. May we all reach our wisest years in good health, and may we all use our good health wisely. Have a good evening.
Thank you. And may I say thank you to all of you who are here, and especially to these people who let me come in.
And please join us for a reception outside so you can speak with Mrs. Hynes personally.
One, two, trim and tall.
Good. Great. It was fabulous.
Fabulous. You tell the best stories in the world. You tell the best stories. It's so rare.